Imagine a single country spending more on its military every year than the next 10 nations combined, including China, Russia, India, the UK, and France. That country is the United States. This one fact alone immediately raises a powerful question. Why does America spend so much on defense? And what does that number actually represent? Most people hear the figure hundreds of billions of dollars, but very few truly understand its global scale or implications. To grasp the shock, you first have to zoom out. In a single fiscal year, the U.S. military budget crosses levels that many countries' entire national budgets never reach. This isn't just defense spending in isolation. It's a financial force that shapes global politics, international security, and even world economics. While other nations debate whether they can afford a new aircraft squadron or a single naval upgrade, the United States debates how many fleets, bases, and next-generation weapon systems it should fund simultaneously. Now compare this with China, the world's second-largest military spender. Even at its peak estimates, China spends less than half of what the U.S. allocates. Russia, often portrayed as a military superpower, spends a fraction of the American total. Add together the military budgets of several major powers, and the U.S. still outpaces them. This is not coincidence. It is deliberate strategy. The United States doesn't aim to be slightly stronger than its rivals. It aims to be dominant on every front, in every region, at all times. Here's where the comparison becomes even more startling. Many countries design their militaries for regional defense. Their budgets are focused on protecting borders, airspace, and nearby waters. The U.S. military, however, is designed for global reach. Its budget reflects not just defense of American soil, but the ability to deploy forces anywhere on Earth within hours or days. Aircraft carriers roaming the oceans, air bases scattered across continents, satellites circling the planet. All of this is baked into the cost. Another hook that grabs attention. The U.S. doesn't just fund soldiers and weapons. It funds readiness. That means constant training, massive war simulations, fuel reserves, intelligence networks, cyber defense units, and space operations. While some countries keep equipment in storage to save money, the U.S. keeps much of its force actively prepared, which is significantly more expensive. Readiness costs money, even when no war is being fought. The comparison becomes even more dramatic when you look at allies. Many NATO countries rely on the U.S. military umbrella. Their defense budgets are smaller partly because America's presence fills the gap. In effect, the U.S. military budget subsidizes global security arrangements, whether critics like to admit it or not. This creates a world where American spending isn't just national. It is international by impact. Then there's the psychological dimension. Military spending is also about perception. Deterrence isn't only built with missiles and jets. It's built with numbers that send the message. When rival nations see budget figures that dwarf their own, it signals capability, endurance, and technological depth. The U.S. budget is as much a strategic signal as it is a financial document. And here's a detail most people miss. The headline number often understates the real scale. Official defense budgets don't always include veterans' care, nuclear programs managed by other departments, or long-term interest on war-related spending. When those are added, the gap between the U.S. and the rest of the world grows even wider. So when people hear that the United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, it's not just a shocking statistic. It has a window into how America sees its role in the world, how it plans for threats that may never come, and how global power in the modern era is measured not just in soldiers or weapons, but in sustained financial commitment at a scale no other nation has ever matched. Picture a timeline where every major global crisis leaves a permanent mark on a nation's wallet. To understand today's massive U.S. military budget, you have to go back decades, long before modern drones, stealth jets, or cyber warfare even existed. The story of American defense spending is not a straight line. It's a series of sharp rises driven by fear, ambition, and global responsibility. Everything changed during World War II. Before the 1940s, the United States maintained a relatively modest standing military. Defense spending existed, but it was nowhere near dominant in the national budget. Then came a global war that demanded total mobilization. Factories were converted overnight, millions of soldiers were trained, and military spending exploded at a scale never seen before. That war permanently altered how the U.S. viewed security. After victory, America did not return to pre-war military levels, and that decision shaped the modern world. Almost immediately, a new threat emerged: the Cold War. The rivalry with the Soviet Union created a mindset where preparedness became permanent. Instead of mobilizing only during wars, the U.S. began spending heavily in anticipation of conflict. Nuclear weapons, long-range bombers, submarines, and intercontinental missiles required constant funding, even in peacetime. This era introduced the idea that military strength had to be maintained continuously, not rebuilt when danger arrived. Here's the hook most people miss. During the Cold War, the U.S. military budget wasn't just about fighting wars, it was about preventing them. Deterrence became the core philosophy. Massive spending was justified as the price of avoiding nuclear catastrophe. Each year, billions were poured into systems designed never to be used, yet always ready. That mindset still echoes through today's defense planning. Then came the post-Cold War illusion. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many believed military spending would finally shrink. For a brief moment, budgets stabilized. Some bases closed, some forces downsized. But the idea of a peace dividend didn't last long. New conflicts quickly filled the gap, proving that global instability didn't disappear with one rival. The attacks of September 11, 2001, marked another historic turning point. Overnight, U.S. military spending surged again, this time driven by counterterrorism and long-term overseas wars. Afghanistan and Iraq weren't short campaigns. They became multi-decade operations. The cost wasn't just bombs and troops. It included logistics, reconstruction, intelligence expansion, homeland security, and veterans care. Defense spending became deeply intertwined with national security beyond the battlefield. Another hook: unlike past wars, the post-9/11 era normalized open-ended military spending. There was no clear endpoint, no formal victory declaration that allowed budgets to shrink. Funding flowed year after year, embedding high defense spending into the normal functioning of government. Technology also changed the equation. As warfare became more advanced, it became more expensive. Modern jets cost exponentially more than their Cold War predecessors. Precision weapons replaced mass-produced arms. Cyber defense, satellite networks, and data systems introduced entirely new budget categories. Every historical era added layers of cost without fully removing the old ones. Even when large-scale ground wars began to wind down, spending did not collapse. Instead, it shifted. Resources moved toward modernization, future threats, and strategic competition. The focus turned to near-peer rivals, emerging technologies, and long-term dominance rather than immediate battlefield needs. So today's U.S. military budget is not the result of a single decision or administration. It is the accumulated outcome of World War II mobilization, Cold War deterrence, post-9/11's global conflict, and decades of technological escalation layered on top of one another, each era leaving behind structures, commitments, and expectations that continue to demand funding. What if a country decided that its security should not begin at its own borders, but thousands of miles beyond them? That single idea sits at the core of why the United States maintains global military dominance. Unlike most nations, America does not build its military solely to defend its homeland. It builds it to shape events far from its shores, long before threats ever reach its cities. After World War II, the United States emerged with unmatched economic and military power, and with that power came a strategic choice. Instead of retreating inward, America chose to remain outward-facing, committing itself to alliances, trade routes, and global stability. This decision required something unprecedented, a military capable of operating on every continent, in every ocean, and in every domain: land, sea, air, cyber, and space. Here's the hook many people overlook. Global dominance isn't about fighting constant wars. It's about being able to fight anywhere at any moment. That capability alone demands enormous spending. Maintaining aircraft carrier strike groups that can sail for months, air forces that can deploy across oceans in hours, and logistics chains that stretch across the globe is incredibly expensive, even when no shots are fired. The U.S. military functions as a global presence force. Bases in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond aren't just symbols. They are strategic anchors. They allow rapid response to crises, reassure allies, and discourage adversaries from taking risks. This constant forward presence reduces reaction time, but dramatically increases costs. Housing troops abroad, maintaining foreign infrastructure, and supporting families overseas all add layers of expense that regional powers simply don't face. Another powerful hook is the concept of deterrence through visibility. When U.S. forces are visibly present in key regions, potential adversaries must assume that any aggressive move will face immediate resistance. This visibility is intentional and costly. Patrols, joint exercises, naval deployments, and air policing missions happen daily, not occasionally. Each operation reinforces dominance, and each one requires fuel, maintenance, personnel, and planning. Global dominance also depends on alliances. The U.S. is tied into security agreements with dozens of countries. NATO alone represents a collective defense commitment that effectively extends America's security responsibilities across much of Europe. Similar commitments exist in Asia and elsewhere. Supporting these alliances means investing in interoperability, shared training, intelligence integration, and advanced communication systems. These aren't optional expenses. They are the price of leadership within a global security network. There's also the economic dimension that often goes unnoticed. The global economy relies heavily on secure sea lanes, stable regions, and predictable trade routes. The U.S. Navy, in particular, plays a major role in safeguarding these routes. From the Strait of Hormuz to the Pacific shipping corridors, American naval dominance underwrites global commerce. This mission isn't officially labeled as defense of trade, but it's deeply connected to why the military operates far from home. Technology multiplies this dominance, but also its cost. To stay ahead globally, the U.S. invests in capabilities that can defeat advanced threats in any environment. That means stealth aircraft for contested airspace, submarines that can operate undetected for months, cyber units that defend digital infrastructure, and space assets that support navigation and communication worldwide. Dominance must exist in every domain simultaneously, not just one. Another hook. Once dominance becomes the standard, maintaining it becomes non-negotiable. Falling behind even briefly could invite challenges. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where spending is justified not only by current threats, but by the fear of losing advantage. Global dominance, once established, demands constant reinforcement. At its core, U.S. global military dominance is about shaping the world before crises erupt, projecting power to prevent conflict, reassure allies, and signal resolve, a strategy that requires enormous, continuous investment across geography, technology, and time. Most people think the U.S. military budget is just one giant number approved once a year, but that belief hides a much more complex reality. The moment you hear Pentagon budget, it sounds straightforward, yet the truth is layered, fragmented, and deliberately difficult to follow. That confusion alone becomes a hook, because what the public sees is not always what the government actually spends. Start with the official defense budget. This is the number most headlines report, voted on by Congress and assigned to the Department of Defense. It covers salaries, weapons, training, operations, and maintenance. On paper, it looks massive, but here, as the hook, it is not the full cost of America as military power. Not even close. To understand the real picture, you have to separate defense spending from national security spending. Defense spending refers specifically to the Pentagon's budget. National security spending goes much further. It includes nuclear weapons programs managed outside the Department of Defense, intelligence agencies, homeland security operations, and long-term obligations tied to past wars. These costs don't disappear just because troops come home. One of the most overlooked components is nuclear weapons management. While delivery systems like bombers and submarines are funded through the Pentagon, the actual nuclear warheads fall under a different department entirely. That means a significant portion of America, as most destructive capability, is funded outside the official military budget, quietly inflating the true cost of defense without ever appearing in the headline figure. Then there's veterans care, a financial shadow that follows every conflict long after the fighting ends. Medical care, disability payments, pensions, and rehabilitation programs for millions of veterans are funded through separate government channels. These are not optional expenses. They are moral and legal obligations. Yet they are rarely included when people talk about how much the U.S. spends on the military, even though they are direct consequences of military action. Another hook lies in war-related interest payments. When wars are funded through borrowing instead of immediate taxation, the interest accumulates for decades. That interest becomes part of the cost of national security, even though it shows up in an entirely different section of the federal budget. In other words, some military spending doesn't happen on the battlefield. It happens on balance sheets years later. Intelligence agencies add another layer. Surveillance, data collection, cyber defense, and global intelligence operations are central to modern warfare. Yet many of these agencies operate with budgets that are partially classified and technically separate from the Pentagon. When people imagine military power, they picture tanks and jets. But today, some of the most expensive operations happen behind computer screens. Homeland Security further expands the definition. Border protection, counterterrorism, infrastructure protection, and emergency preparedness all fall under national security. These programs grew rapidly after major global threats, and once created, they became permanent. Their budgets rarely shrink, even when the immediate threat fades. Here is another hook most people never consider. The Pentagon budget itself contains internal layers that blur accountability. Funds are divided into personnel, operations, procurement, research, and construction, but money often shifts between categories. Emergency authorizations, supplemental funding bills, and contingency operations allow spending to increase without appearing as a direct budget hike. What looks stable on paper may be expanding quietly in practice. The complexity isn't accidental. Large systems often become complex to reduce scrutiny. When spending is spread across multiple departments, agencies, and classifications, it becomes harder for the public to track total costs or question priorities. This doesn't require secrecy to work. Complexity alone can obscure reality. When all these elements are combined, Pentagon funding nuclear programs, veterans care, intelligence operations, homeland security, and interest on war debt, the true cost of U.S. national security grows far beyond the number most people recognize, revealing a system where military power is financed through multiple channels, each justified individually, but rarely viewed as a single whole. When people imagine military spending, they often picture jets screaming across the sky or massive warships cutting through oceans. But the largest and most consistent expense is far more human. At the heart of the U.S. military budget sits a simple truth that surprises many viewers. People cost money every single day, whether a war is happening or not. And the United States maintains one of the largest, most complex human military systems ever created. Start with active duty personnel. Millions of men and women across the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force, and reserve components receive regular paychecks. These aren't just basic salaries. Pay scales increase with rank, experience, specialized skills, and hazardous duty. Pilots, cyber specialists, submarine crews, and special operations forces all receive additional compensation. This structure is designed to attract and retain highly trained professionals in an all-volunteer force, but it comes at a significant financial cost. Here is a hook that often surprises audiences. The U.S. doesn't just pay soldiers for fighting, it pays them for readiness. Even in peacetime, troops must be available, trained, medically cleared, and deployable at any moment. That means continuous income, benefits, and support, regardless of whether a single shot is fired. Healthcare is one of the largest hidden drivers of personnel costs. Active duty service members and their families receive comprehensive medical coverage. This includes routine care, surgeries, mental health services, rehabilitation, and long-term treatment for injuries sustained both in training and combat. Military healthcare systems operate like a massive national health network, with hospitals, clinics, doctors, and support staff spread across the country and overseas. Then there are housing allowances. Many service members live off base, receiving monthly stipends adjusted for local cost of living. In high-cost areas, these allowances can be substantial. On-base housing, meanwhile, requires construction, maintenance, utilities, and securities. Even when troops are deployed, housing infrastructure must be maintained for their return. Another hook most people overlook is family support. The U.S. military invests heavily in schools, childcare programs, counseling services, and relocation assistance for military families. These programs are essential for force stability. Frequent relocations, long deployments, and high-stress environments make military life uniquely demanding, and without these support systems, retention would collapse. Supporting families isn't charity, it's operational necessity. Retirement and pensions add another massive layer. After decades of service, military personnel qualify for lifetime retirement pay. This creates a long-term financial obligation that extends far beyond a soldier's active years. Every new recruit represents not just a current expense, but a future one. These obligations accumulate across generations, forming a permanent baseline in the defense budget. Veterans' benefits amplify this further. Disability compensation, education assistance, job training programs, and medical care continue for years, sometimes a lifetime, after service ends. Modern warfare has improved survival rates, but that also means more veterans living with long-term physical and psychological injuries. Treating post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injuries, and chronic conditions requires sustained funding long after conflicts fade from headlines. Here's another powerful hook. Unlike weapons programs that can be delayed or canceled, personnel costs are politically and morally untouchable. You can postpone buying a jet. You cannot stop paying soldiers or veterans. These costs are fixed, predictable, and unavoidable, which makes them one of the most stable and largest components of the military budget. Training also feeds into personnel spending. Every soldier represents an investment in education, skill development, and specialization. From basic training to advanced technical schools, the cost of preparing a single service member can reach hundreds of thousands of dollars over a career. Losing trained personnel due to poor compensation would mean losing that investment, forcing the system to spend even more on replacements. In the end, the U.S. military budget reflects a reality that raw numbers often hide. Military power is not just built from steel and technology, but from people, whose pay, health, families, and futures are permanently woven into the cost of national defense. Most people assume a military only costs money when it is actively fighting a war, but the reality is far more expensive and far more constant. One of the biggest drivers of U.S. military spending happens quietly, every single day, under a concept known as readiness. Readiness means being able to fight immediately, anywhere in the world, without warning, and that state of constant preparedness comes with an enormous price tag. Here is the first hook that surprises many viewers. The U.S. military spends billions training for wars that may never happen. Pilots fly thousands of hours without ever seeing combat. Naval crews conduct endless drills at sea. Ground forces rehearse urban combat in mock cities built specifically for training. None of this generates headlines, yet it consumes a massive portion of the defense budget. Training begins the moment a service member enters the military and never truly stops. Basic training alone requires facilities, instructors, equipment, medical screening, housing, food, and logistics. But that's only the foundation. After basic training, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines move into specialized schools that can last months or even years. Each specialty, from jet pilots to cyber operators, has its own costly pipeline, often involving advanced simulators, classified systems, and highly skilled instructors. Another hook many people miss is how expensive realism has become. Modern training is designed to closely mirror real combat conditions. Live-fire exercises use real ammunition. Flight training burns massive amounts of jet fuel. Naval exercises deploy entire fleets for weeks at a time. These drills are intentionally intense because mistakes in training are cheaper than mistakes in war. But cheaper does not mean cheap. Readiness also means maintenance, which is inseparable from training. Equipment must be operational at all times. Aircraft require constant inspections. Ships undergo continuous repairs. Vehicles are tested, repaired, and tested again. Much of this maintenance happens even if the equipment never leaves base. A jet sitting idle still costs money, because if it can't fly today, readiness is compromised. Then there are large-scale war games and joint exercises. The U.S. military regularly conducts multinational drills with allies across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. These exercises simulate real conflict scenarios involving thousands of troops, aircraft, ships, and command centers. The goal is coordination and interoperability, but the cost includes transportation, fuel, temporary infrastructure, and months of planning. These exercises exist not for show, but to prove that forces can actually work together under pressure. Another powerful hook is the concept of time. Readiness is measured in minutes and hours, not days. Units must be able to deploy immediately, which means keeping forces on alert status around the clock. Crews rotate shifts. Equipment remains powered and monitored. Intelligence systems stay active. All of this consumes resources continuously, even during periods of peace. Simulation technology adds another layer. Advanced simulators allow pilots to train for extreme scenarios without risking lives or equipment. But these systems are extraordinarily expensive to develop and maintain. Virtual battlefields, cyber ranges, and AI-driven training environments are now standard. While they reduce some risks, they add significant upfront and ongoing costs to the readiness budget. Medical readiness is another overlooked factor. Troops must be physically and mentally fit to deploy. This requires constant medical evaluations, fitness programs, mental health services, and rehabilitation. Injuries during training are common, and treating them is part of maintaining a ready force. A unit that is not medically cleared is not considered deployable, regardless of its equipment. Here's another hook that reframes the issue. Readiness is perishable. Skills fade without practice. Equipment degrades without use. Coordination breaks down without repetition. This forces the military into a cycle where training can never truly stop. Pausing readiness to save money would mean paying even more later to rebuild lost capability. Even logistics are trained extensively. Supplying fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts across continents is rehearsed repeatedly. Convoys, airlifts, and sea lift operations are practiced under simulated combat conditions, because failure in logistics can end a war faster than enemy fire. These rehearsals consume enormous resources, but are considered non-negotiable. Readiness spending, at its core, reflects a philosophy that the worst time to prepare for a war is after it has already started, and maintaining that level of preparation requires constant investment in people, equipment, time, and systems operating at full capacity every day. Most people imagine weapons appearing almost magically on the battlefield, but the reality is far slower, far more complex, and far more expensive. The journey from an idea to a deployed weapon can take decades, and every step of that journey is tied directly to why the U.S. military budget keeps growing. The procurement process isn't just about buying weapons. It is about designing the future of warfare long before the first shot is ever fired. Here is a hook that immediately changes perspective. The U.S. military doesn't buy weapons for today's wars. It buys them for wars that might happen 20 or even 30 years from now. That single fact explains why costs escalate so quickly. By the time a system is approved, it must still be relevant decades into the future, capable of surviving threats that don't even exist yet. The process often begins with threat assessment. Military planners analyze potential rivals, emerging technologies, and future battlefields. These assessments shape requirements, not designs. Instead of saying, "Build this jet," the Pentagon defines what the jet must do: range, speed, stealth, data sharing, survivability, and adaptability. These requirements alone can take years to finalize, and every added capability increases complexity and cost. Once requirements are set, research and development begins. This phase consumes billions before a single operational weapon exists. Engineers test materials, software, engines, sensors, and integration systems. Prototypes fail, designs change, and timelines slip. Unlike consumer technology, military systems must operate in extreme environments, withstand enemy attacks, and function reliably under combat stress. Failure is not an option, so testing becomes exhaustive and expensive. Here's another hook most people never hear. Changing one requirement mid-process can cost billions. If a new threat emerges or technology advances, the system must be redesigned to adapt. These changes ripple through the entire program, delaying production and inflating budgets. What looks like waste is often the cost of trying to future-proof a weapon in an unpredictable world. After development comes testing and evaluation. Weapons are tested not just in controlled environments, but in simulated combat conditions. Aircraft fly thousands of hours. Missiles are launched repeatedly. Ships undergo stress tests at sea. Each test requires personnel, fuel, maintenance, and safety systems. If problems are found, and they often are, the system goes back for redesign, restarting parts of the process. Production introduces another layer of cost. Military manufacturing is not mass production in the civilian sense. Factories are specialized, supply chains are tightly controlled, and components often come from a limited number of approved suppliers. Security requirements restrict competition, which can drive prices higher. Building a small number of extremely advanced systems costs far more per unit than producing millions of simpler ones. Here's a critical hook. Weapons programs don't end when production starts. Once a system enters service, it requires upgrades, spare parts, software updates, and training. Modern weapons are digital platforms, not static machines. Software must be updated to counter new threats. Sensors must be recalibrated. Integration with other systems must be maintained. These ongoing costs are baked into procurement, but rarely discussed. Politics also shapes procurement in ways most viewers don't expect. Large programs often involve factories and jobs spread across multiple states. This makes canceling or reducing a program politically difficult, even if costs rise. Once a program gains momentum, it becomes part of the economic ecosystem, tying defense spending to employment and regional industry. Another hook lies in time. The longer a program takes, the more expensive it becomes. Inflation, labor costs, and technological changes all add up. A jet designed in the 1990s, but deployed decades later, carries the financial weight of every year in between. Delays don't pause spending, they multiply it. Interoperability adds further complexity. U.S. weapons must work seamlessly with allies, joint forces, and multiple branches of the military. This requires standardized systems, shared data links, and compatibility testing across platforms. Each additional integration requirement increases development time and cost, but is considered essential for modern coalition warfare. Procurement is also shaped by risk management. The U.S. often chooses fewer, more capable systems rather than large numbers of simpler ones. This concentrates cost into individual platforms. Losing one system becomes expensive, but the trade-off is technological superiority. This philosophy pushes budgets higher, but aligns with a strategy focused on dominance rather than parity. At every stage, the procurement process reflects a central reality. Building weapons that must outperform every potential adversary, survive future threats, and remain relevant for decades is not just expensive by choice, but expensive by design. When people hear about trillion-dollar military budgets, they often assume the money is spread evenly across countless small projects, but the reality is far more dramatic. A handful of massive weapons programs consume staggering amounts of funding, so large that a single project can cost more than the entire defense budget of many countries. These programs aren't just expensive. They redefine what expensive means in modern warfare. Here is a hook that immediately reframes everything. Some U.S. weapons programs are so costly that canceling them becomes harder than finishing them. Once billions have already been spent, walking away can feel more dangerous than continuing, even if costs spiral far beyond original estimates. Take modern fighter aircraft programs as an example. These jets are not just airplanes. They are flying networks of sensors, software, stealth materials, and weapon systems. Designing a jet that can evade radar, collect battlefield data, communicate with satellites, and survive in hostile airspace requires decades of research. Each additional capability adds layers of complexity, testing, and redesign, pushing costs higher with every iteration. Another hook most people don't realize: the price tag isn't just about building the weapon, it is about sustaining it for decades. A fighter jet program might span 40 to 50 years from initial concept to retirement. Over that lifespan, costs include upgrades, spare parts, software patches, training simulators, and maintenance infrastructure. The sticker price is only the beginning. Aircraft carriers represent another extreme. Each carrier is essentially a floating city, complete with airfields, power plants, hospitals, and defensive systems. Building one takes years and requires thousands of workers, specialized shipyards, and advanced materials. But the real cost emerges after launch. Crews of thousands must be paid, trained, and supported. Escort ships, aircraft wings, and global maintenance cycles all multiply the expense. Here's another powerful hook. One aircraft carrier group represents a commitment measured not in billions, but in generations. Once deployed, that carrier shapes military planning for decades. Replacing or retiring it requires planning far in advance, locking future budgets into long-term obligations. Nuclear weapons modernization adds yet another layer of cost. Even though these weapons are rarely discussed openly, maintaining and upgrading nuclear forces is one of the most expensive responsibilities of the U.S. military. Submarines, bombers, and missile systems must remain operational at all times. Safety, reliability, and command systems are non-negotiable, which drives continuous spending even in the absence of active conflict. Missile defense programs also rank among the most expensive undertakings. Developing systems capable of detecting, tracking, and intercepting incoming missiles requires global radar networks, space-based sensors, and rapid response interceptors. Each test launch can cost millions of dollars, and failure is part of the process. Every failed test leads to redesign, retesting, and further investment. Another hook that often shocks viewers. Many of the most expensive programs were originally sold as cost-saving solutions. New systems promise efficiency, reduced manpower, and lower long-term expenses. Yet as requirements expand and threats evolve, those promises are repeatedly revised. What begins as a streamlined replacement becomes a multi-role platform expected to do everything at once. Space-related military programs have quietly joined this list of high-cost projects. Satellites for communication, navigation, surveillance, and early warning are essential to modern warfare. Building, launching, and protecting these systems requires enormous investment. Once in orbit, they must be monitored, upgraded, and defended against interference, turning space into another expensive operational domain. Here's another hook. Cost overruns are not always signs of failure. They are often signs of ambition. When a program aims to leap generations ahead of existing technology, uncertainty becomes part of the price. Pushing the limits of physics, software, and material science rarely follows neat budget projections. What makes these programs especially impactful on the defense budget is their scale. When a program grows too large, it begins to shape the entire military around it. Training adapts to it. Strategy assumes its existence. Allies plan around its capabilities. At that point, the program stops being just a weapon and becomes a cornerstone of national defense planning. These massive weapons programs illustrate how U.S. military spending isn't driven by quantity alone, but by a relentless pursuit of technological dominance, where a single platform can absorb resources on a scale that reshapes budgets, priorities, and long-term strategy. When people think of military innovation, they often imagine sleek jets or powerful missiles, but many of the most transformative breakthroughs begin far from the battlefield. Inside research labs, where failure is expected and experimentation is constant. A significant portion of the U.S. military budget is dedicated not to weapons that exist today, but to ideas that might shape warfare decades from now. This is where defense research and innovation quietly consume billions, long before any visible result appears. Here is a hook that changes how viewers see military spending. Some of the most expensive military projects never become weapons at all. They are experiments, proofs of concept, and technological dead ends, and that is by design. Innovation requires risk, and risk means accepting that not every investment will succeed. Defense research operates on a different timeline than commercial technology. Instead of focusing on immediate profit or consumer demand, military research focuses on long-term advantage. Scientists and engineers work on materials that can survive extreme heat, electronics that function under intense radiation, and systems that can operate without human input. These challenges push the limits of physics and computer science, making research both slow and costly. Another powerful hook is the role of government-backed innovation agencies. These organizations fund high-risk, high-reward projects that private companies might avoid. Autonomous systems, advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, and stealth technologies often begin as research grants long before they are linked to a specific weapon program. The military invests in ideas, not because they are guaranteed to work, but because not investing could mean falling behind. Testing innovation is expensive because it often requires building something entirely new. Prototype engines, experimental drones, and advanced sensors must be manufactured in small numbers using custom components. There is no economy of scale at this stage. Each prototype can cost millions, and testing them may destroy them in the process. Failure assentage is possible. It is expected, and every failure carries a price tag. Here is another hook most people don't realize. Military innovation is rarely isolated to one branch or mission. Research projects often aim to support multiple domains at once. A breakthrough in materials science might benefit aircraft, ships, and space systems simultaneously. This interconnectedness increases complexity and cost, as each innovation must meet diverse operational requirements. Cyber and software research add another dimension. Modern warfare relies heavily on data, networks, and algorithms. Developing secure, resilient software capable of operating under cyber attack requires continuous updates and testing. Unlike hardware, software is never truly finished. Vulnerabilities are discovered, threats evolve, and systems must be constantly patched and improved, creating a never-ending cycle of investment. Another hook that reframes the budget. Many everyday civilian technologies trace their origins back to military research. Satellite navigation, the internet, advanced medical techniques, and even touchscreen technology benefited from early defense funding. While these spillover benefits are rarely highlighted in budget debates, they represent long-term returns on research investment that extend far beyond defense. Secrecy also drives up costs. Classified research limits competition and transparency. Projects are restricted to a small pool of cleared contractors, reducing market pressure to lower prices. Security requirements add layers of administration, specialized facilities, and compliance costs that don't exist in civilian research environments. Innovation must also anticipate countermeasures. Developing a new technology isn't enough. Planners must assume adversaries will attempt to copy or defeat it. This leads to parallel research tracks focused on protection, redundancy, and adaptability. For every offensive innovation, there is often a defensive one developed alongside it, doubling investment. Here's another hook. Research spending often increases during peacetime. When active wars wind down, the military shifts focus toward future threats. Budgets move from immediate operations to long-term research, ensuring that technological advantage is preserved even without ongoing conflict. Defense research and innovation represent a quiet but relentless engine of spending, driven by the belief that the next major conflict will be decided not by numbers alone, but by technologies that are still being imagined, tested, and refined long before they ever appear on a battlefield. There is a part of the U.S. military budget that rarely appears in headlines, is almost never discussed in detail, and yet influences some of the most advanced capabilities on Earth. It's often referred to in vague terms, wrapped in mystery, and deliberately obscured from public view. This is where the phrase black budget comes into play, and the moment people hear it, curiosity spikes, because secrecy itself becomes the hook. Here's the first hook that instantly grabs attention. Every year, billions of dollars are spent on military projects that the public is not allowed to know the details of. Not the purpose, not the technology, and sometimes not even the agency responsible. This isn't a conspiracy. It's an officially acknowledged part of national defense. The black budget exists primarily to fund classified programs. These include advanced weapons development, intelligence operations, surveillance systems, experimental aircraft, cyber capabilities, and space-based technologies. The logic is simple but powerful. If adversaries don't know what the U.S. is developing, they can't prepare effective countermeasures. Secrecy itself becomes a strategic weapon. One of the most misunderstood aspects is that the black budget is not completely invisible. Congress approves an overall figure, but the breakdown is classified. Lawmakers with proper clearance review details behind closed doors, while the public sees only a single number. This creates a gap between democratic oversight and operational secrecy, a tension that has existed for decades. Another hook most viewers never consider. Some of the most famous military technologies in history were funded for years through the black budget before anyone knew they existed. Stealth aircraft, reconnaissance satellites, and advanced surveillance systems all operated in secrecy long before their public debut. When they finally appeared, they often seemed to arrive out of nowhere. The cost of secrecy itself is significant. Classified projects require secure facilities, restricted access, background checks, and compartmentalized teams. Engineers may work on isolated pieces of a system without knowing the full picture. This slows development and increases costs, but it reduces the risk of leaks. Every locked door, encrypted file, and cleared contractor adds another layer of expense. Here's another hook. Black budget projects often involve higher failure rates. Cutting-edge experimentation in secret environments limits collaboration and external review. Mistakes are harder to catch early. Redundancy is common, as multiple teams may unknowingly work on similar solutions to avoid single points of failure. These inefficiencies are accepted as the price of secrecy. Intelligence agencies are major beneficiaries of black budget funding. Signals intelligence, cyber surveillance, satellite monitoring, and data analysis programs consume enormous resources. As digital communication has exploded globally, so has the cost of monitoring, processing, and protecting information. Data centers, advanced algorithms, and global infrastructure quietly absorb billions each year. Space is another domain deeply tied to classified spending. Early warning systems, satellite defense mechanisms, and experimental space platforms often fall under black budget categories. These systems operate far beyond public scrutiny, yet they play a crucial role in nuclear deterrence, communication security, and global situational awareness. There is also a strategic timing element. By keeping certain capabilities secret, the U.S. maintains the ability to surprise adversaries during a crisis. Revealing technology too early gives rivals time to adapt. The black budget preserves uncertainty, forcing potential opponents to plan for unknown threats, which can deter aggression without ever firing a shot. Another hook that reshapes perspective. Black budget spending doesn't disappear when wars end. In many cases, it increases. As overt conflicts wind down, focus shifts to intelligence, cyber operations, and next-generation capabilities that operate in the shadows. These tools are designed for long-term competition rather than immediate battlefields. Critics argue that secrecy reduces accountability and makes it harder to assess value for money. Supporters counter that transparency has limits in national defense. This ongoing debate exists precisely because the black budget sits at the intersection of security, democracy, and trust, where too much openness can weaken defense and too much secrecy can erode public confidence. What makes the black budget uniquely powerful is not just what it funds, but what it hides. Capabilities that shape global balance, influence adversary behavior, and redefine warfare long before the public ever becomes aware of their existence.